Ukraine has now conducted two very splashy attacks back to back, and while they may have taken months to prepare, the timing of them could not be any better. You probably have a sense of a growing public pessimism surrounding the war over the last few months, no doubt kicked off by a public meltdown last February, but then evolving into a saga of Trump saying things, then Putin saying things, then Trump saying things, then Putin saying things, to the point that we might as well retitle international relations to Days of Our Diplomacy. What's more, NATO is holding its annual Heads of State Summit at The Hague later this month, which will be prime time to develop good policy. And it would certainly be better for Ukraine if everyone were going into it a bit more optimistic about the war. But the more subtle story took place very far away from all of that. Indeed, what is happening along the Red Sea has interesting implications for Ukraine of all places. So let's get to it, and be especially excited, because we are going to do some finer-grained calculations for the lines on maps in Taiwan, which, again, somehow goes back to Ukraine. More precisely, today we will cover this New York Times report on why the United States declared victory. Much of the narrative there focuses on the balance between deterrence along the Bab el-Mandab Strait and the Taiwan Strait, because they are both naval theaters. But what both the article and the subsequent discussion from the past few weeks miss is an important implication for Ukraine about what naval weakness implies for the White House's armament decisions. And the crazy thing is that it will have a much bigger effect on aid decisions than any of the Days of Our Diplomacy soap opera, even though the soap opera is a constant source of media attention, while the Houthi thing came and went like an afterthought. But at least that means we have a greater saga to study. And it's all the more reason to be thankful that these two incidents broke up the diplomacy drama. But first, let me ask you a question. What do you remember about the end of the US operation in the Red Sea? The thing that made splashy headlines was Trump declaring victory, while the newly minted Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney came to visit the White House. Trump mentioned, offhand may I add, that the Houthis announced to us that they don't want to fight anymore. They have capitulated, but more importantly, they say they will not be blowing up ships anymore. Indeed, it was hard to miss that specific headline. Well above 400 total news sources, and perhaps the biggest story of the day, even as there was skepticism about Trump's claims. But you may have missed the confirmed fact that the conflict is still ongoing, with the Houthis having switched to missile strikes directly on Israel. The problem is bad enough that international airlines are canceling flights to the country, leaving Israelis with few and expensive travel options. The Houthis are even trying to initiate a maritime blockade of a key Israeli port, though good luck trying to enforce that. Each of these stories received substantially less coverage than the headlines that Trump creates, and that is why it is critical to have a news source that you can trust to deliver you the important, under-the-radar stories on the topics that you care about. Well, today's sponsor, Ground News, makes it easy for you by creating a feed of the topics you care about the most. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take an excellent 40% off their Vantage plan for all that and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. And now back to the Red Sea. Prologue: The Red Sea Crisis. We should start with some background on the report. I will make this fast by just going through the basic history. On October 7th, 2022, Hamas attacked Israel. Soon thereafter, Israel invaded Gaza, a process that would drag on for longer than many had anticipated at the time. Public sentiment within the Arab world regarding Israel dropped to a new low, but the enfeebled Hamas could not pick up the banner. Fast forward a year to October 2023, when Yemeni Houthis began striking Israeli-affiliated ships passing through the Bab el-Mandab Strait. Ostensibly, this was in solidarity with Hamas's struggle, but it was also a clever marketing strategy to convince volunteers to join the organization, and for donors to send money their way. However, very surprisingly, it turns out that international shipping insurance companies do not believe that a rebel group with a proto-government based in Yemen's capital has the most discerning of target selection. And thus insurance rates exploded for everyone, Israeli affiliated or not. Passage through the strait correspondingly plummeted from about 75 ships per week to 30 ships per week. This concerned the United States, still under the Biden administration, because if there is one thing that the U.S. Navy loves, it is ice cream. But if there is a second thing that the U.S. Navy loves, it is freedom of navigation. So the United States began delivering daily doses of freedom through Operation Prosperity Guardian, attacking the Houthis at the source. Fast forward again to December 2024, and ship passages increased to, still 30 per week. How frustrating. That takes us to the Trump administration, and revelations from this New York Times article about Trump's thought process here. And as you are listening to this, if you want to work out on your own what the problem for Ukraine is, remember that Trump's Department of Defense wants to prioritize China. I know I just added a third country to the mix, but as a hint, remember that this is the mess of the world that we currently live in. Act 1. Trump's Plan. The contents of the New York Times article tells us about the White House's feelings and strategy regarding the Houthis. Trump was frustrated that more than a year of effort had not provided any relief along the Red Sea, and concluded that he needed to step up the U.S. intervention. Commander of U.S. Central Command, and yes, that is his real title, Michael Eric Kurilla, proposed a long-term campaign that would begin by destroying the Houthis' air defense systems, and then transition to targeted assassinations. Within 8 to 10 months, the Houthi problem would disappear. Operations began on March 15th. Perhaps you received a text message with the details? Anyway, the initial signal coming from Yemen suggested a solid start, and indeed there were plenty of explosions over the following month. However, about $1 billion in costs had been racked up over that time. The United States had lost several MQ-9 Reaper drones and was taxing otherwise critical systems, like Patriot missile defense batteries. 2 aircraft carriers were overseeing operations, extending normal mission times and delaying maintenance schedules. And that is when the reserves problem came into focus. War planners calculated that there were plenty for the Houthi situation, but if another conflict opened up along another front, the United States would face a shortage. This echoed a problem discussed at length with arming Ukraine. The peace dividend from the end of the Cold War had also left stocks of ship and jet-fired missiles precariously low. If the operation continued for 8 to 10 months as Kurilla envisioned, the Pentagon wondered what would be left over to use against China. China being a magic word to presidential ears, Trump looked to reassess the situation. Intelligence estimates indicated that the United States had reduced Houthi capacity over the 30-day period, but it would be fleeting if operations ended then. Trump had 2 options to mull over. First was to further ramp up the strikes for another 30-day period, and then reassess the situation. The second was to play a long game and factor in Yemen's civil war. The Houthis are a rebel movement that only control part of the country, having seized the capital from the former government 11 years earlier. The United States could partner with the original government to go on an offensive. Operation Prosperity Guardian would effectively switch to air support, which would soften the Houthis and make them vulnerable to a ground attack, a classic type of complementary strategy. One might conceptualize it as a repeat of the intervention in Libya from 2011, except Washington would have a much better idea of what the post-conflict government would look like. However, as Trump weighed his options, the costs only mounted for the United States, and in an embarrassing fashion. On April 28th, the Houthis launched a barrage of missiles at the USS Truman. The Truman had to take evasive action. One slight problem: an FA-18 Super Hornet was not locked down. When the Truman turned to avoid the missiles, it fell into the Red Sea. $67 million gone. Act 2. Negotiations. or negotiations. Trump was looking for an off-ramp, and many in his orbit agreed. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane, Vice President J.D. Vance, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was not yet National Security Advisor and on his way to taking over every job in the United States by 2029. And after pursuing the wrong path, Trump was soon going to be pushed in the right direction. Oman offered an elegant solution. The United States would terminate its air operations. In exchange, the Houthis would pledge to give American ships free passage through the region. It was not quite freedom of navigation, but it was something. On May 6th, Trump announced a ceasefire. For those listening to the news, it sounded like the United States had met its operational goals. But the conversations inside the White House suggest otherwise, and actions along the strait cast further doubt. After all of that, the number of weekly passages stands at 30, the same as before. Meanwhile, the United States keeps its deployment in the region, as though it is in a holding pattern. Now, vessel transits can be a lagging indicator, because charter ships will not show up to a new location overnight. Remember, the Houthis say that they will still be attacking Israeli ships, while the bombing campaign has effectively transitioned from the United States to Israel. It is as if those with a serious financial stake in the situation do not believe that the Houthis will or even can be selective. And to add insult to injury, the United States lost another F/A-18 Super Hornet when the capture process failed during an attempted landing. Another $67 million vanishing to the bottom of the sea. Act 3. Fallout. Whatever the public perception of an American victory on the Red Sea was, foreign intelligence organizations will have no problem figuring out the truth. This was a disappointing performance for the U.S. military, and that has spillover effects to other countries, which then has spillover effects to yet more countries. It is no secret that Trump wants to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, and specifically to protect Taiwan from a PRC invasion. The probability of success there depends on two things. One, Beijing's ability to push men and materiel across the strait, and two, the subsequent land war that occurs conditional on a successful first phase. Both steps have to work for the PRC to win, whereas Taiwan only needs one step to fail. Well, what happened in the Red Sea is a red flag for U.S. interests involving Red China. To be clear, no one should draw a one-to-one comparison between the two. In Yemen, the United States was trying to project power using its naval assets. It was an asymmetric battle, with a strategy of using aircraft to defend sea-based trade against low-tech, land-based missiles and drones. In a war against China, in contrast, there will be traditional naval battles, as U.S. ships attempt to stop PLAN vessels from reaching Taiwan. Less ice cream, more turret firing. But there will also be a heavy component of using carriers as mobile bases to strike terrestrial Chinese assets. And, presumably, American struggles in Yemen will carry over to a much stronger opponent, even as the war planners learn their lessons from the operation. Let's think for a moment about what the task in the Indo-Pacific is. As before, we will use this line to represent Beijing's expected probability of success if it invades Taiwan. Meanwhile, let the space between the white and red lines represent Beijing's cost to fight, converted to portions of Taiwanese sovereignty. The goal is to keep the white line low enough that the costs, which are tied to it, fall below zero. Well, zero in terms of the PRC's probability of winning. That would make fighting to capture Taiwan net unprofitable to Beijing, and so the PRC stays on the mainland. Remember, though, that success is a two-step process, a naval battle and then a ground assault. Call the probability of the PRC succeeding on one front P, and the other Q. Thus, this white line is the product of those two numbers. That is why they both need to be close to 1 to raise the mainland's probability of victory up to here, but either of them can be close to 0 to get it down to here. Okay, well, what does the US performance in Yemen tell the world about American preparations for the Indo-Pacific battle? Right, it is that China is more likely to win the naval portion of the conflict. In turn, that makes the outcome of the ground battle more important for determining the ultimate outcome of the war. The upshot for Taiwan, which, by the way, is still hosting US policymakers, much to Beijing's frustration, is that, for decades, the island has overemphasized the maritime portion of the battle process. In recent years, however, there has been a re-emphasis on making the terrestrial segment a real conflict, with a boost to defense spending to cover it, and longer mandatory military service to power it. The bad news is that Taiwan has placed a ton of orders for US equipment, but has grown increasingly frustrated at the delays in deliveries. And perhaps you may now see how this connects to Ukraine. There is a misconception that Ukraine and Taiwan exist in completely separate universes of the US military, that Taiwan is the realm of the Navy, Ukraine is the realm of the Army, and never shall the two meet. And that may be true from a soldier's or sailor's perspective. Those serving in the US Navy have a good shot of experiencing combat if the PRC invades Taiwan. But the US Army fighting in Taiwan is substantially less likely, even as American troops would be a factor in a European war. Well, presumably. Trump might add some caveats to that sentence. Nevertheless, from a materiel perspective, there is enormous overlap. The tools that Kyiv wants to fight off Russia are the same things that Taipei needs to handle the ground-based portion of an invasion. Before Trump escalated anything with the Houthis, the thinking inside of the Pentagon was that Taiwan should receive priority because, once a Chinese invasion begins, the United States would struggle to make any deliveries to the embattled island. Actually, we have an entire video about that. Well, everything that the Pentagon learned from the Houthi confrontation will reinforce that belief, making it all the harder for Ukraine to convince the Trump administration to expand aid to the country, and also making the saga way more important than anything else happening in the days of our diplomacy soap opera. However, Ukraine's pair of strikes act as a counterbalance to the White House's decision-making. Even if you disagree with the whole premise of trying to balance interests in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, that does not change the fact that it is deeply built into the Pentagon's thinking at the moment. After everything that happened along the Red Sea, it is easy to imagine Trump going into the NATO meeting and not even entertaining the idea of supplementing Ukraine. Now, at least other NATO members have a fighting chance at making that argument. After all, Russia could also play a role in a war in the Indo-Pacific. But if Ukraine is destroying Russia's fleet of bombers, it would be all the more difficult for the Kremlin to make an impact out east. And if the Allies want to convince Trump, that is the type of argument that they will have to make. That additional support for Ukraine could be an investment that will bring back much greater security returns. Like sands through the hourglass, so are these outros. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take an excellent 40% off their Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.